Story number 1. In the heart of a rare Georgia snowstorm, where the world turned white and silent, Elias and his father stumbled upon a figure that didn't belong, their old house. Creaking under the weight of history, stood on cursed ground, its air thick with secrets older than the pines. A silhouette moved against the snow, small and frail, a child lost in the freezing night. The funeral home on the hill cast an eerie glow, its lights framing a boy who shouldn't be there, his face pale as death. When he followed them inside, only to vanish like mist. Elias knew the snow hid more than cold. It hid a tragedy that refused to rest. The house seemed to sigh, its walls whispering of a boy who'd been waiting for someone to care, for a warmth he'd never found. The fog clung to the ground, heavy and watchful, as if the storm itself was alive. Elias and his father, bound by instinct, ventured into the night to save a stranger. But the boy's eyes held a story that chilled them. Each step toward him felt like crossing a threshold, a line between the living and something else. The snow fell harder, swallowing their tracks, as if the land wanted to keep it secret. By the time they realized the boy was gone, the night had claimed a piece of them, leaving a memory that would haunt Elias forever. Back when I lived in Georgia, Columbus, I lived in this really old, terrible house on a property developed back in the late 1800s. The land was a patchwork of soils, a gardener's dream turned nightmare for Elias, whose allergies flared in the pollen-choked air. The guy who originally bought the land and developed it was a real piece of works because the property has like 9 different soil types on it, so he could make his own personal little paradise garden. Only the rare snows or heavy rains offered relief, all except during the particularly heavy rains that washed away the literal waves of pollen and the rare snowy winters that we had there. Anyway, it's one of these rare snowy winters. The house groaned under a blanket of snow, its old bones creaking in the cold. Elias, barely out of his teens, stayed up late, keeping his father company. But me and my dad are doing stuff around the house. His father, a retired Marine, drowned his ghosts in whiskey. His words, a torrent of stories. He's drinking hard because he's a retired Marine, and Marines all have drinking problems to cope with PT. Elias, sober and patient, humored him, and I'm awake despite the late hour. So he has someone other than my mom to best with his incessant talking. The fire in the hearth flickered low. We're loading the fireplace. Though the dogs are sleeping, the firewood pile dwindled, forcing them outside. We see the firewood pile is low, and both go out to grab some more firewood, by which I mean mostly me carrying it because Dad's drunk and he's about to fall over. The snow fell softly now, the air thick with fog. In any case, it's no longer snowing super hard, but it's still going, and it's foggy as heck out there. Beyond the house, a funeral home loomed on a hill, its lights cutting through the mist, a retaining pond separating it from their property. There's a funeral home on the top of the hill beyond the house. It's past this sort of mid-sized retaining pond or pit that keeps our house from flooding when it rains real bad here. And the parking lot of the home had a couple of street lights as well. Then they saw it, a small shape against the snow, lit by the funeral home's glow from the lights nearest our house. Though me and my dad see a silhouette out against the snow, it's small, maybe just over 4 feet tall, which says, "Child." Elias's heart tightened. No child should be out in this storm. And me and my dad, being the at least halfway decent people that we are, start going up to see what the heck this is all about. The snow crunched under their boots, the fog swallowing sound as they approached. The figure was a boy, no older than 10, his skin ghostly pale, his body trembling in a thin nightgown. He cannot be more than 10, maybe 11 years old, pale as death, like he's been out in the snow for hours. And all he's wearing is a nightgown. His eyes, wide with fear, locked on them, silent and unyielding. He looks terrified, and he's shaking and just stares at us, not saying a word. Elias's father, sobering fast, spoke gently. Dad sobers up almost instantly and gently tells the kid to follow us. Well, we got to get him inside. I mean, he's going to freeze to death out here. Elias nodded, reaching out, but the boy flinched, and we reach out to offer him a hand, but he recoils away and doesn't touch me. But he nods a bit when we gently invite him in. They led him down the hill, promising warmth, promised to get him warmed up and maybe something to eat or drink, and follow us down the hill and into the house. Inside the laundry room, the boy's demeanor shifted, his fear melting into calm. His face lights up immediately as soon as he's past the back door and in what is ostensibly our laundry room. He stops shivering. He stops looking scared, and he just looks calm, content now. Elias felt a flicker of relief, but the air felt wrong, heavy with something unspoken. They turned to grab blankets. Dad and I turned to rush off to get him some blankets, towels, set up a space heater and all that. But in that fleeting moment, the boy vanished. We'd both turned away from him for less than 2 seconds, and I turned back around real quick because I was going to ask him if he wanted soup or maybe some chicken or something, and he was just gone. Elias's breath caught, his eyes scanning the empty room. I grabbed Dad's arm and he turns back, and he almost turns as white as the kid was. They rushed outside, but the snow was pristine, marked only by their boots. We look outside. We weirdly see no footprints. The boy was barefoot, but the only tracks that were made were me and my kiss or boots, nothing else. The silence pressed in, the fog, a veil hiding answers. Dad and I just stared at each other for a while. Elias's father, shaken, questioned his sobriety. But Elias knew what he'd seen. Dad was clearly questioning whether or not he had some kind of a drunken hallucination, except for the fact that I was there and I had seen the boy too. And I mean, I almost never touch booze, so that was definitely not a hallucination on my end. They asked neighbors, desperate for answers. Over the following week and a half, that both of us asked around about a boy in a nightgown. And it wasn't until Dad mentioned it to old Miss Thunderberg. The old woman, her memory sharp despite her years, shared a tale from her childhood. Anyway, according to Mrs. Thunderberg, when she was a child, and the area was a lot less developed before she was born, there was an old ghost story about a boy who had been found dead in a rare Georgia snowstorm not far from where our house was. Apparently, this boy was also in nothing but a nightgown. No one knew why he died, but sightings of a small figure in snowstorms were whispered about. All anyone had was guesses. but it wasn't uncommon for people to claim seeing a boy, or at least his silhouette, in our area in the dead of night during really bad snowstorms. Elias and his father pieced together a theory, the best guess that me and my dad could come up with after Mrs. Thunderberg told us all that we knew, is that the kid must have gotten locked outside of his house or something. Perhaps a tragic accident, a door locked in a blizzard, had sealed his fate. I can also only hope by tragic accident rather than active cruelty or whatever, judging by what me and my dad saw. The boy had been pretty damn frail, and he would have been frozen to death quickly once the mercury went to like 32 Fahrenheit or lower or whatever, but he disappeared when we brought him inside. The boy's calm face, his sudden absence, haunted them. I can still see his face when I think about it, the half-frozen, scared little face. Did it really take 100-some-odd years or more for someone to even care enough to try and bring him out of the cold like that? If that's the case, that is truly tragic. Years later, Elias carried the memory, its edges sharp. No one else reported that seeing the boy, and the house stood silent, its secrets buried in the snow. He wondered if the boy had found peace, if their kindness had freed him, or if he still wandered, waiting for another storm to bring him home. Story number 2. The forest was a quiet escape, its paths winding through ancient trees, but for young Finn, it was a world of adventure. Until tonight, the Irish Midlands, with their sleepy villages and endless fields, felt like a cage for a restless 14-year-old, with his border collie, Macy, by his side. He'd roamed these woods countless times, but as dusk settled, the air turned heavy, the shadows sharper. A man appeared on the trail behind him, his steps too deliberate, his presence a silent threat. Finn's heart quickened. This wasn't just a walk anymore. The woods were usually a haven, a place where Finn and Macy could lose themselves in games of hide and seek among the trees. But tonight, the forest felt different, its silence not peaceful, but watchful, as if it knew something Finn didn't. He'd taken a shortcut, a narrow trail cutting through the dense undergrowth, hoping to beat the dark. Following down one of these side trails, me and Macy stumbled upon a small sort of teepee-shaped hut made from logs. The log teepee, a familiar spot for their games, stood like a sentinel in the fading light. But something was off. A prickle on Finn's skin, a whisper of danger in the rustling leaves. He glanced back, and there he was, a man, walking 20 meters behind, his figure just visible in the dimming light. Staring down the entryway, I then saw a man walking 20 meters behind, having just taken this side trail. Finn's gut twisted, an instinct he couldn't name. For some unknown reason, I had a strange instant feeling about this man, even though I had only just noticed him. The man's gait was odd, purposeful, not the casual stride of a jogger or dog walker. Finn's mind raced. Was he paranoid? Or was this man following him? He clipped Macy's leash on, her ears twitching, sensing his unease. I quickly latched my lead back onto Macy and hurriedly made my way down the trail. The trail wound back to the main path, but the darkness was closing in, the forest swallowing the last of the daylight. A few minutes later, although I had reached back onto the main trail, the evening had already turned much darker. Finn glanced back again, his breath catching. The man was closer, now just 10 meters away, a shadow curving through the trees. So again, turning to see if the man was behind me, I could still see him around the curve, only 10 meters away from me. Finn tried to calm himself, to dismiss the fear as teenage nerves. Now, I did try to tell myself that I was just being paranoid and that this man was most likely not following me or anything, but my gut instinct just still told me that something was off. He fumbled for his phone, calling his dad, praying for an answer, thinking ahead. I pull out my phone to call my dad as to make sure that he was already in the parking space waiting for me. No response. But there was no answer. His dad was driving, Finn told himself. But the silence on the line felt like a betrayal. The forest's quiet was no longer a comfort. It was a trap, and Finn was alone with Macy and the stranger. The car park loomed ahead, a small clearing in the darkness. But it was empty, save for one vehicle, not his father's. By the time that I made it back to the car park, it was basically pitch black now, and there was just one single car in the parking area, but it wasn't my dad's. Finn sat at a picnic bench, Macy at his feet, her whines cutting through the night, sitting down by a picnic bench to wait for him to come and get us. All I could do was hope that he would be coming soon, and that this strange man from the woods was not following me after all. He stared at his phone, trying to look busy, unapproachable. Only a minute or two later, I could hear the footsteps of this very same man approaching through the darkness. The man emerged, his silhouette stark against the dark, anxiously anticipating him to pass by. I tried to distract myself on my phone, or at least make myself seem less approachable. He walked past, climbing into the lone car, but he didn't leave. Thankfully enough, the man just walks completely by me. Entering the car park, the man then gets into his vehicle, the only car in the car park, but he doesn't drive away. The engine hummed, headlights cutting through the night, pinning Finn in their glare. He just stays there, sat inside of his car with both the engine and the headlights turned on. Minutes dragged, 20, maybe more, each one heavier than the last. 20 minutes must have gone by. But my dad still wasn't here. Finn texted his dad, his fingers shaking, but got no reply. And yet, this very same stranger was trying to call and text my dad to say that I was waiting for him. I was met with no answer. He tried to rationalize the man's actions. Maybe he was waiting for someone else, but the excuses felt hollow. While I continued waiting, I tried to rationalize why this man hadn't decided to drive off yet. Whatever reasons I came up with, they were not very convincing for me. Macy's whining grew frantic, her paws digging a deep hole beneath the bench, her unease mirroring Finn's. What made this situation even more anxiety-inducing, though, was that my dog Macy had been endlessly whining by my feet, scraping dirt away beneath the bench to make a surprisingly deep hole. Finally, the man's car reversed, headlights sweeping across the lot as he drove away. Thankfully, after what felt like longer than 20 or so minutes, the strange man, already with his engine and headlights on, reverses from his parking spot, exits out of the car park and onto the main road, leaving me and Macy in peace. Relief washed over Finn, but the darkness of the empty lot felt no safer. And although we are now alone, basically stranded outside of a dark forest, I couldn't help but feel a huge sigh of relief come over me. 10 minutes later, his father arrived, his excuse infuriating. He'd forgotten to pick them up. My dad did eventually come and get us 10 minutes after the man had finally decided to drive off. And do you want to know what my dad's excuse was as to why he was so late? He forgot that he had to pick us up. Finn sat in silence on the drive home. The man's headlights burned into his memory. Now, I don't know if that man really was following me through the forest, although it certainly seemed like it. And I also don't know why he just sat in the car for 20 minutes, seemingly just watching me. The forest, once a place of adventure, was now a warning. But if I had to learn anything from that experience, it would be that my dad can sometimes be just a careless douche. And two, never hike through the forest alone late in the evening like I did. Finn never walked alone at dusk again. The stranger's presence a shadow that lingered, a reminder that some dangers hide in plain sight. Story number 3. The night was still, the kind of quiet that amplifies every sound in a rough neighborhood. A sudden bang shattered the silence, followed by a cry that tore through the darkness. It wasn't just a noise, it was a plea, desperate and raw, from someone who needed help. But in a place where trust was scarce, opening the door could be a mistake. For Ethan, that night would blur the line between compassion and danger, leaving him haunted. Ethan and his brother were jolted awake by loud banging and crying at their front door. They lived in a tough neighborhood, so his brother grabbed a shotgun, yelling through the door to leave. Both were tired and freaked out. A recent car break-in by a local girl made them wary. Ethan peered through the door's one-way film window, seeing no one else outside. Crouching by the door, he heard a young girl, hysterical, begging to call her mom. He told her he was calling 911. Help was coming. His brother, adrenaline pumping, opened the door, shotgun in hand, shouting at her to calm down. Ethan disagreed with the approach, but she'd woken half the block. Pressed against their door, he saw her, a kid, kneeling, her eyes breaking his heart. Her gaze was wild, not just scared but lost, like she'd seen something unspeakable. Ethan thought she was about, but she claimed a car crashed down the street, left her phoneless, unable to call her mom. Her story didn't add up. So he questioned her. Something was wrong. Her words felt rehearsed, her panic too intense. She begged him to walk to the crash site, but he refused, insisting on waiting for police. 10 minutes later, 3 tow trucks passed. Heading to the reported crash, feeling safer, Ethan walked with her. She kept asking to hold his hand, making him uneasy, a teenager, barely dressed, and he, a grown man in a stirred-up neighborhood. He asked her age. She said 18 and grabbed his hand. He felt uncomfortable, but her distress overshadowed his. Her grip was tight, her fingers cold, like she was clinging to life itself. Halfway there, a cop arrived. Ethan flagged them down, explaining. She repeated, "I have bad ADHD and anxiety." Handing him false eyelashes, he took them reluctantly to calm her. One officer questioned her separately, while another told Ethan a prior call reported a barefoot teen running across a lawn. Ethan noticed she was barefoot. Then they cuffed her, suspecting she was on something, which Ethan half believed. Her eyes didn't match her story. They held a secret, not just fear. The officer saw the eyelashes and asked, "What'll you do with those, bro?" Ethan replied, I'll sleep on it, just want bed." He went home, talked to a neighbor who assumed it was her parents' house and avoided domestic drama. Ethan figured that's why no one else helped. He couldn't sleep, shaken and worried for her. imagining her trauma. He didn't know if her reaction was justified or if she was on drugs or mentally ill, but prayed for her and her family, knowing it was a bad situation. The night clung to him, her desperate cries echoing in his mind. Ethan shared the story with another neighbor the next day, an old man who'd seen plenty in the area. Kids like that, they're running from something or to something, he said, his voice low. He mentioned a string of late-night incidents, teens knocking on doors, claiming accidents, then vanishing. Some say they're bait, luring folks out for worse, he warned. Ethan's stomach dropped, recalling his walk with her, her insistence on holding his hand. Was she leading him somewhere? He checked local news, finding reports of scams in the neighborhood, young people posing as victims to draw residents outside. None mentioned a girl with her exact story, but the pattern was eerie. Ethan asked a friend who worked dispatch about the crash. No record of a wreck that night, she said, but we got calls about a barefoot girl. The tow trucks puzzled him. Why were they there if no crash was confirmed? He wondered if they were part of something bigger, something planned. Ethan stopped answering his door at night, even for familiar faces. Some evenings, he hears a faint knock, checks the window, and sees nothing but darkness, yet feels eyes watching. The girl's face, her false lashes in his hand, stayed with him, a reminder that kindness could be a trap in a place like this. Story number 4. The theater building loomed like a relic, its Grecian pillars casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. A young woman hurried toward it, her sewing kit tucked under her arm. Unaware of the figure watching from the sidelines, he stood against the stone staircase, his heavy parka and snow boots jarring against the warm spring day. His eyes, cold and unblinking, followed her every step, a silent promise of something sinister. This was no ordinary stranger. He was a hunter, and she was his mark. The campus, small and familiar, suddenly felt like a labyrinth with no safe exit. The glass doors of the entrance glinted, reflecting her unease. She'd seen every face on this campus, but his was new, unknown, wrong. His gaze wasn't casual. It was a weight, pinning her in place as she climbed the steps. She forced a smile, a reflex of politeness, but his expression didn't shift. His stare cutting through her like a blade. Why was he here? And what did he want with her? The theater, her sanctuary of creativity, now pulsed with a quiet threat. The costume shop in the basement was a maze of fabric and shadows, its isolation both comfort and cage. She worked alone, the hum of her sewing machine a steady rhythm. But the memory of that stranger lingered. Each creak of the old building felt like a footstep, each flicker of light a warning. The door to the courtyard, locked from the outside, was her only barrier to the world beyond. But what if he'd found a way in? The thought tightened her chest, her needle trembling in her hand. The courtyard itself was no haven, a fenced-in tangle of machinery and silence. The chain-link barrier at feet high should have kept him out, but reason was unraveling. She sensed him before she saw him. His presence a shadow cast across her work. The door's window, once empty, now framed a face. His face, expressionless, staring through the glass. He was here, and he wasn't leaving. Her sanctuary had become a trap, and the stranger at the courtyard door was closing in. The clock ticked toward dusk, each second a step closer to danger. She was alone. Her colleagues gone, the building's labyrinthine halls offering no escape. His hands tested the door, deliberate, relentless, as if he knew she was watching. She needed a plan, a way to outsmart the threat beyond the glass. But how do you flee from someone who shouldn't be there, someone who defies every rule of safety? The stranger at the courtyard door was no coincidence. He had chosen her, and the night was far from over. At 22, Lily was weeks from graduating with a theater arts degree, needing only a quarter credit to finish. She worked in the theater department's costume shop to earn that credit, sewing and mending costumes for a musical with intricate designs. She knew hand sewing and how to use a sewing machine, spending time adjusting garments for actors. Excited to complete her degree, she went to the costume shop, which opened at noon, but woke at 1 o'clock after staying up late. She rushed to maximize her hours, but as she approached the theater building, a guy standing by the front entrance caught her eye. The entrance was grand, with Grecian pillars and 3 sets of glass doors led by steps. The old building housed classrooms, while an addition held the theater. But this entrance was closest to the backstage route to the costume shop. The man leaned against the stone side of the staircase, his greasy hair, tattered jeans, and heavy winter parka, and snow boots odd for the 65-degree weather on her small campus. She usually recognized faces, but didn't know him. He looked her age, but out of place. They made eye contact. She gave a polite nod and smile, but he didn't smile back, his eyes following her up the stairs. Lily felt uneasy, but brushed it off. Her campus attracted weirdos, but she thought she'd cataloged them all. This Parker guy wasn't one. In the costume shop, a colleague she knew somewhat personally noticed her troubled look and asked what was wrong. She mentioned the stranger, and they speculated before her colleague checked upstairs, returning to say he was gone. Lily worked on sewing halved beach balls into a bikini top for the funky show, listening to a podcast. By 4:30, her colleague left, leaving her alone, and she moved to sewing snaps onto a blouse. She took a break for a Monday project, then resumed, headphones off, since she was alone. The shop in the basement was hard to find, shaped like an irregular rectangle with sewing tables in the middle. It connected to backstage, the black box theater, dressing rooms, and a hallway to the auditorium and an exit. A door near the tables led to a weird little courtyard the costume director warned against, as it locked from outside. The courtyard was a fenced-in area with machinery for heating, cooling, and electrical systems, enclosed by a 15-foot chain-link fence. Lily sat opposite the courtyard door, about 20 feet away, working until nearly 6 o'clock for Monday's dress rehearsals. A noise startled her, breaking her rhythm. She dropped her needle, still threaded, and bent to pick it up. Looking up, she saw the courtyard door's window wasn't empty. Parker Guy was there, trying to open it. She froze. Their eyes locked, his face blank. The door was locked, so he couldn't enter. She realized he must have scaled the fence, as it was the only way into the courtyard. Fear hit as he tried the door again. She stood, moving to the studio door on her left, which locked from inside, and hid in the fabric storage room, shutting the door and calling campus safety. Terrified, she waited. Campus safety arrived quickly, but the guy was gone, impossibly fast over the fence. They escorted her to her dorm and fetched dinner from the dining hall, a kindness she appreciated later. An officer took her statement, but could only keep watch for the guy. Lily never learned who he was or why he targeted her, but his predatory behavior left her shaken, a shadow lingering over her final days at college. The encounter marked Lily. The theater, once her haven, now held a shadow of threat. She questioned her choice to smile, to stay alone, to call campus safety instead of police. The courtyard, with its towering fence and silent machinery, was no longer just a quirky warning. It was a barrier that had barely held. The stranger's blank stare haunted her, a reminder that safety was fragile. She finished her graduate, but the memory of that flash at the glass lingered, a warning that some dangers come without reason, watching from the edges of the world. Story number 4. The room was a fortress of flickering light, the glow of a video game casting jagged shadows on the walls. 12-year-old Caleb sat cross-legged on his bed, his controller gripped tightly, the hum of the console a familiar comfort. My cousin was staying at my house because he had broken his knee and needed help getting around and all that. He was a little bit older than me, but we were super close. Their summer nights were filled with laughter, junk food, and pixelated battles, but tonight, Caleb was alone. One night, though, I was in my room playing video games by myself. The house felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed against his ears, making every creak of the old floorboards sound like a warning. My cousin was in the living room. I'm not sure what he was doing, but I know that we were the only ones home at this stage. The screen flickered, and Caleb's heart skipped. It was getting late, and I was about to shut everything down and go to sleep when I saw something. The room's edges seemed to blur. The darkness beyond the console's glow thicker than it should be. Something started crawling toward me in the dark. It wasn't a shadow. It was solid, moving with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, its limbs twisted in ways that defied bone and muscle. It looked human, but not quite. It was all messed up and deformed. Caleb's breath caught, his fingers frozen on the controller as the thing inched closer, its form barely lit by the screen's faint light. The way that it moved, it didn't seem right at all. A sound broke the silence, low and guttural, like air escaping a broken pipe. It also made these weird noises that I still have a hard time describing. The noise wasn't human, wasn't animal. It was wrong. A vibration that crawled under Caleb's skin, making his teeth ache. At first, I thought it was my cousin playing some kind of a sick prank on me until I remembered that his leg was broken. His cousin, stuck on crutches, couldn't move like that, couldn't crawl. He couldn't even crawl like that if he wanted to. Caleb's mind screamed, this wasn't a prank, wasn't a game. That was when I absolutely lost it. His heart pounded, a drumbeat of panic, urging him to flee. He bolted, the controller clattering to the floor. I ran out of that room as quickly as I could, and I didn't even look back. Caleb stumbled into the living room, his breath ragged, his eyes wide. I told my cousin what I saw. His cousin, sprawled on the couch, looked up, skeptical but uneasy. He didn't really believe me, but I could tell that he was creeped out, too. Caleb's words tumbled out, describing the thing, its twisted limbs, its unnatural sounds, but his cousin's doubt only deepened Caleb's fear. And after that, I refused to sleep in my room for at least a week. He dragged a blanket to the couch, the living room's lights blazing, a shield against the dark. I just crashed on the couch in the living room, and I kept the lights on all night. The house never felt the same. I ended up living in that house for another 6 years after that. Nothing quite like that ever happened again. But the room was tainted, its air heavy with an unseen presence. But that room just never really felt right after that. I always had this weird, heavy feeling when I was in there, like I was being watched or something. Caleb avoided it when he could, sleeping with the door open, the lights on, but the feeling followed him, a weight that clung to his thoughts. I don't know what I saw that night, and I honestly don't care if people believe me or not. I know what I saw and experienced to this day. The memory chilled him, a shadow that never fully faded. Caleb grew up, but the night stayed with him, a scar on his memory, and to this day, I still get chills even thinking about it. He'd wake sometimes, certain he heard that sound again, a low, guttural hum just beyond his bedroom door. I've obviously moved since then, but every now and then I get scared that something like that might happen again. He moved to a new city, a new house, but the fear lingered, surfacing in quiet moments. The new house was modern, bright, but its corners seemed to hold secrets, shadows that moved when he wasn't looking. Caleb stopped playing video games alone at night, afraid the screen's glow might summon something else. He tried talking to his cousin years later, but the memory was a wedge between them. His cousin laughed it off, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear, as if he'd felt something that night too. Caleb dug into the house's history, finding old records of the neighborhood. The land had once been a marsh, drained for homes, but locals spoke of things that lingered in the damp earth, things that didn't belong. An old article mentioned a family who'd fled the house decades ago, claiming their child saw a thing that crawled in the dark. Caleb's stomach churned. Had it been waiting for him, too? The fear grew, subtle but persistent. At night, Caleb would hear faint taps on his walls, rhythmic, like something testing the boundaries of his home. He installed locks, kept lights on, but the feeling of being watched never left. One night, he found scratches on his bedroom floor, thin and uneven, as if made by twisted fingers. He contacted a psychic, a woman named Ellen, who knew the town's darker tales. Ellen listened, her face grim. Some things don't leave. They latch onto you, feed on your fear. She said, that house, that room, it was a door and you opened it. Ellen offered a ritual, salt, candles, words to seal the door, but it meant returning to the old house. Caleb refused, the memory of that crawling thing too vivid, but the sins grew bolder. His dreams filled with twisted shapes, sounds that weren't there. He tried protective charms, burning sage, but the air in his home grew heavy, oppressive. One night, he woke to a shadow at the foot of his bed, not moving, just watching, its form barely human. He didn't sleep again, haunted by the thought that it had followed him, that it was still there. The crawler was his now, and it wasn't letting go. Story number 6. The ancestral home stood weathered but proud, its 50-year-old walls steeped in the stories of a small Philippine town. For Maria and her boyfriend, Carlo, it was a temporary haven, a place to call home while they carved out their future. The house creaked with age, its rooms filled with whispers of folklore Maria had dismissed as childhood tales. But on this night, as the world outside slept, those whispers grew louder, curling through the darkness like a warning she couldn't ignore. Maria lay in bed, her phone glowing with a YouTube video. The only light in their rectangular room. Carlo slept beside her, his breaths deep and steady. The windows across from the bed framing a quiet night. The house felt still, too still, as if it were holding its breath. Maria adjusted her position, the bed creaking softly, her eyes flicking to the corner where the router's blinking lights usually cast a familiar glow. Tonight, that corner was dark, too dark. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. The router's lights were gone, swallowed by a blackness that seemed to pulse, to breathe. Maria blinked, waiting for her eyes to adjust. But the darkness held firm, unnatural, like a void carved into the room. Then she saw it, a shape, tall and looming, its head brushing the ceiling. The shadow of a man, silent and still, stood in the corner, watching her with an intensity that froze her heart. Maria's breath caught, her phone slipping from her hands. She stared, unblinking, for what felt like an eternity, trying to convince herself it was a dream, a trick of tired eyes. But the figure didn't waver, its presence heavy, undeniable. She wanted to wake Carlo, to scream, but her voice was trapped, her body locked in place. The shadow didn't move, didn't speak, but it saw her, and that was enough to make her blood run cold. Finally, she tore her gaze away, curling into Carlo, her heart pounding. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination playing tricks in the dead of night. Sleep came reluctantly, pulling her under, but the image of that shadow lingered, a stain on her mind. By morning, the room felt normal again, the router's lights blinking as if nothing had happened. But the weight of the night clung to her, a fear she couldn't shake. So, me and my boyfriend, we were living at my family's ancestral home in the Philippines. Our house is around 50 years old at this stage. Maria had grown up hearing tales of spirits and curses tied to the house, but she'd laughed them off, her modern mind dismissing them as superstition. And growing up, I had heard a lot of stories and folklores that surrounded our house, but I never really believed in them. That skepticism felt hollow now, after what she'd seen. My boyfriend was already sleeping soundly while I was watching YouTube on the bed while facing against him. Carlo's steady breathing had been a comfort, but earlier he'd stirred, his voice sharp with irritation. And all of a sudden, he just seemed to get mad at me for being too fidgety and said that he woke up because I was tapping his foot. I said to him that I wasn't doing anything. Maria had brushed it off, blaming a dream, but his words echoed in her mind now, unsettling her. At around 2 to 4 somewhere around there, I suddenly woke up, and I was really confused because I thought that I was dreaming. The memory of that moment hit her hard as she sat up in bed the next morning, the sunlight doing little to ease her unease. You see, while I was looking around the room, I noticed that the right corner of our room was really dark, which was weird because our very flashy internet router was supposed to be there. The darkness had been wrong, unnatural. And then the shadow had appeared. I looked up at the corner, waiting for my eyes to adjust. until I saw a very tall shadow of a man. Maria's hands trembled as she recounted the night to Carlo, her voice low as she pointed to the corner. Eventually, I went to the bathroom, and when I came back to bed, I said to him, "You know, I had a really weird dream last night. I woke up and looked here." Before she could finish, Carlo's face paled, and before I could finish, he said, "You saw it too, the tall man." Goosebumps erupted across Maria's skin. I instantly had goosebumps because of what he said. Carlo confessed he'd seen it too, woken by a strange tapping on his foot. I said to him that I saw it when I woke up in the middle of the night, and he said that he saw it when he woke up too, and got mad at me because he felt tapping on his foot. He'd stayed silent to avoid scaring her, unsure of his own eyes. The shared vision shattered their doubts. The house's stories no longer just tales. They called a priest that day, his chants and blessings filling the house with a fragile peace. Needless to say, we called the priest and had him bless our room in the whole house even, and after that, we didn't have any more incidences. The blessing held, the shadow never returned, but Maria and Carlo were changed. The house, once a comforting link to her family's past, now felt like a place where the veil between worlds was thin. They moved through their days cautiously, avoiding that corner, half expecting the darkness to return. The folklore Maria had dismissed as a child now lingered in her thoughts, a reminder that some things, seen or unseen, were real enough to haunt them forever. Story number 7. The room was a cocoon of dim light, the Xbox's glow casting shadows across the walls. Ethan, a teenager, sat alone, the night outside his open window a silent void. The rural cold seeped in, but it was nothing compared to the sudden chill that gripped him, a wave of ice coursing through his veins, his body locked, paralyzed by a fear that came from nowhere, as if the darkness itself had turned its gaze upon him. Something was out there, just beyond the glass, and it wasn't human. The window was a portal to the unknown, its frame framing a field that stretched into nothingness. Ethan's heart pounded, each beat a warning that he was no longer alone. The air grew heavy, charged with a presence that felt ancient, benevolent, watching him from the shadows. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. As the certainty grew, whatever was out there knew he was here, and it wanted him to know it was watching. The house was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that amplifies every creak, every whisper of the night. Ethan's room, once a sanctuary, felt like a trap. The open window, an invitation he hadn't meant to send. The fear wasn't just in his mind, it was physical, a cold grip that pinned him to his chair. Whatever waited outside wasn't just curious, it was hungry, its intent a blade slicing through the calm of the night. He fought the paralysis, his body trembling as he forced himself to turn, avoiding the window's pull. The field beyond was a sea of darkness, but he knew it hid something that had chosen this moment to reveal itself. Ethan's mind raced with stories, tales of things that stalked the countryside, things that didn't belong to this world. The window was a threshold, and he was on the wrong side of it. The fear was a living thing, wrapping around him like a shroud. But Ethan broke free, diving for his bed, seeking safety under the blankets. The night was still, but it wasn't empty. He could feel it watching, waiting for him to make a move. The window loomed above, a gateway to whatever horror lurked outside, and Ethan knew he had to face it, or it would come for him. Ethan's room was a small fortress, the Xbox a distraction from the rural quiet. I was playing Xbox in my room at night with my window down, and suddenly I got this cold ice feeling in my veins. From my head to my toes in a sort of intense rush, and I was rendered completely paralyzed from fear. The terror was instant, overwhelming, and I knew something was behind me outside my wide open window. It felt like pure evil, a threat beyond words. It felt evil, and I felt in danger beyond words to describe. He summoned the courage to move, avoiding the window's gaze. Finally, I somehow got enough nerve to turn around, and I broke free from this paralyzing fear that was gripping my whole body and spin around, purposely avoiding looking at my window. Dive into my bed, it being right below the same window, under the blankets. He listened, heart racing. I hid under my blankets and was listening for anything that could tell me if there was something out there. Minutes passed in silence, and he peeked out. After a few minutes of not hearing or seeing anything, I grabbed the windowsill and slowly peeked over and out of my window to see if I could see anything. Outside, his PT Cruiser sat in the cold. At the time, I owned a PT Cruiser. It was parked outside about 15 feet away, directly adjacent from my window. Then he saw it, a tall gray figure, cloaked in static haze, rising from behind the car. And to my astonishment, this tall gray thing, it looked like it had a fuzzy-like static that clung to its entire body as well. It stood up, and it turned its head in my direction, and it had no face at all, just completely flat and gray. It was impossibly tall, its limbs thin and elongated. The top of the cruiser was a little below the waist of this thing, so it was extremely tall, and it had really thin arms and legs, and they were long and skinny. The figure moved, emitting a sound like wind mixed with TV static, stopping when it stilled. Another weird characteristic was that it moved, and only when it moved, it made a sound like rushing wind or a river rushing from a distance, almost like white noise, but really loud TV static noise with a wind sound. When it stopped moving, the sound would stop also. The night was windless, making the sound alien, and it was a cold winter night with no wind and no sounds either. So because of that, it stuck out and was super out of place sounding. It turned toward Ethan, its faceless gaze locking onto him. This flat, faceless thing turned towards me, and I assume it was looking at me. Its movements were mechanical, deliberate. Then, in the most robotic-looking way possible, its waist turned away from me. Then its upper body, and then its head turned away last and rushed into the darkness, into the field. It crossed a fence effortlessly, trailing static smoke, and without skipping a beat in stride, it walked over a 5-foot cattle fence like it was nothing. The static smoke that clung to its body became really static-looking and like a heavy smoke. It trailed behind it and slowly fell to the ground and disappeared after a few seconds. The figure vanished into the field, leaving Ethan trembling. It walked until the darkness seemed to swallow it up, and I couldn't see it anymore, and it disappeared. He searched for answers, finding only vague parallels online. Now, I've done some research on words, and things like naked slender man is the closest thing that I could compare it to. The trauma lingered, keeping him from the field for years. This experience scared the heck out of me so bad. And it wasn't until about 3 years ago that I was, for the first time in 11 years since that experience, actually able to go out into that field to shut the chickens in for the night. Ethan still lived in that house, the memory a scar. And I'm 30 now, and I still haven't forgotten it. I still live in that same house to this day. The field was a forbidden place, its darkness a reminder of the watcher's gaze, its promise to return. Ethan locked his windows, avoided the night, but the fear remained, a whisper that the faceless thing was still out there, waiting for him to step into its domain. Story number 8. The McDonald's was a ghost town, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly in the empty dining area. 9-year-old Tommy bounced with excitement as his mother, Laura, led him and his friend Sophie into the restaurant, their chatter echoing off the tiled walls. The indoor play place, a maze of colorful tubes, promised a night of fun after their meal, but something felt off. The lone man at a corner table, his eyes hidden behind a newspaper, seemed to watch their every move. Tommy, oblivious to danger, grinned at the prospect of new friends. His mother's warnings about strangers rang in his ears, but they felt distant, drowned out by the lure of adventure. In the quiet of the near-empty restaurant, a trap was already being set. The play area smelled of fries and plastic, a child's paradise under the harsh glow of overhead lights. Tommy and Sophie scarfed down their nuggets, then scrambled into the tunnels, giggling as they slid through. Laura and her friend, Sophie's mom, sipped coffee at a nearby table, their voices a soft hum. Tommy, ever the chatterbox, noticed the man still sitting alone, his presence like a shadow in the bright room. His curiosity burned. Why was this man here, all by himself? For whatever reason, seeing a person alone, Tommy went up to him with his friend to start up a conversation, introducing himself and to Sophie, talking about his interests in school. The man barely looked up, his face half hidden, but Tommy prattled on, sharing details about his favorite games, his teacher, even his street name. The man eventually left them alone after he called someone on his phone, speaking in a different language Tommy didn't recognize. Sophie tugged Tommy back to the play area, and they dove into their games, the man's silence forgotten. But the air had shifted, a subtle tension creeping into the restaurant, unnoticed by the children. Hours passed, the play place a blur of laughter, until a new figure appeared, a burly man with a young girl, her ponytail bouncing as she ran to the glass barrier, her eyes locked on Tommy, a smile too eager, too knowing. The girl ran up to the glass dividing the counters from the play area and yelled Tommy's name excitedly. He froze, confused. She looked at his age, but her face was unfamiliar. She started telling him things about himself, implying she knew him and he forgot her, wanting him to come outside to hang out. Her words echoed Tommy's earlier conversation with the man, his school, his games, details no stranger should know. Tommy, naive and trusting, started toward the door, but Laura's instincts flared. She ran over to grab him, dragging him out of the other exit to the car, clearly terrified and stressed. Her hands shook as she shoved Tommy into the back seat, her eyes darting to the man and girl now heading to their own car. Laura peeled out of the parking lot, her heart racing As the other car's headlights appeared in her rearview mirror, the man with the little girl got in his own car and began chasing them. The streets blurred as Laura took sharp turns, weaving through unfamiliar roads to shake their pursuers. Tommy, bewildered, demanded to know why he couldn't play with the girl, but Laura's silence was heavy with fear. Finally, the headlights faded, the chase lost in the maze of suburban streets. Laura explained it was likely a kidnapping scheme, and Tommy needed to stop telling strangers so much about himself. The weight of her words sank in. Tommy's chatter had nearly led him into a trap. Back home, Laura's voice trembled as she scolded Tommy, her relief battling her terror. The memory of that night became a shadow over Tommy's childhood, a lesson carved in fear. He didn't understand how a little girl his age could be involved with kidnapping another kid. But now he got it, a horrifying situation narrowly avoided. As an adult, Tommy realized the girl was likely a lure, coached to exploit his trust. He never returned to that McDonald's, and his talkative nature dimmed, replaced by caution. Laura installed a security system, her vigilance now a constant guard against unseen threats. The man and the girl were gone, but their intent lingered, a reminder that danger could hide behind a child's smile. Story number 9. The house was a prison, its walls heavy with secrets that Emma couldn't grasp. At 7, she was a quiet girl, her childhood a blur of pain she couldn't recall, only fragments pieced together from whispers and reports. But one figure stood out, a woman she called Auntie. A gentle presence in a sterile living room, typing every word Emma spoke. Auntie was a safe harbor, or so Emma thought. Her soft voice and kind eyes promising trust. But something about those meetings felt wrong, like a puzzle missing its edges. Emma's life was a storm, her mother's cruelty a constant thunder. By 14, the weight of her past, abuse, neglect, horrors she couldn't name, pushed her to the edge. She poured her heart out to Auntie, confessing thoughts of ending it all, begging for answers. But Auntie's responses were hollow, her words deflecting, defending the mother who broke Emma's spirit. The room where they met, once warm, grew cold, its air thick with an unspoken betrayal Emma couldn't yet see. Years passed, and Auntie's questions sharpened, cutting into Emma's secrets, parties, drinks, rebellion. Emma, now 16, felt exposed, her life laid bare under Auntie's gaze. The sessions weren't help, they were surveillance. Each meeting ended with Auntie calling Emma's mother in, repeating every word, turning Emma's pain into ammunition. The realization hit like a blade. Auntie wasn't her savior. She was something else, something tied to her mother's control. One night, driven by despair, Emma tore through her mother's room, searching for anything to escape the pain. In a closet, hidden beneath the cues, she found a suitcase, its contents a shock that froze her heart. Papers, hundreds of them, detailed every session with Auntie, every secret Emma had spilled. The words weren't therapy, they were a record, a betrayal, written in ink. Emma's world tilted, the truth clawing at her. Auntie wasn't who she claimed to be. She stole her mother's phone, fleeing to a buzz, her hands trembling as she scrolled through messages. There, buried in texts, was Auntie's name, not a psychologist, but a friend. Her mother's friend. From before Emma was born, the sessions, the trust, the years of confessions, all a lie. a trap to keep Emma tethered. The betrayal burned, a wound deeper than any her mother had inflicted. Emma was alone, and the truth was a monster she couldn't unsee. Emma's childhood was a void, a black hole from birth to 13, pieced together from sparse memories, things her family told her, and police reports. One constant was a lady she called Auntie, with no first name, no last name, starting at 7. Emma saw her in her living room, where Auntie typed everything she said on a laptop. She seemed kind, trustworthy, so Emma saw her once a month and thought she could trust her. By 14, Emma was breaking. She admitted to Auntie that she tried to self-delete numerous times, driven by her mother's increasing toxicity, lack of social interaction, and the horrors of her childhood. She questioned why the sessions never helped. She begged Auntie to tell her why she constantly wanted to end herself. On the way to a session, she asked her mother if she could see a different person for help, but was hissed at to be quiet. Her mother's cruelty grew, and Emma cried about it during sessions. But Auntie defended her mother, or made Emma feel she was blowing things out of proportion. At 16, Emma rebelled. She went to parties, drank, and didn't tell anyone. Auntie's questions turned eerily specific, asking about the parties and her actions. Shocking Emma, she gave Auntie the benefit of the doubt, thinking she just knew her well after years. But a year later, Auntie brought up the parties without hiding, and at the end of each session, invited Emma's mother in to tell her everything Emma said. It was devastating. Hearing her own words about her mother's abuse said to her face as she sat next to her. Emma's life unraveled, her grades dropped, her mother forbade her from going out, and she was isolated. In desperation, Emma ran into her mother's room, looking for something to overdose with. She found a walk-in closet she'd barely entered and stumbled upon a suitcase under the clothes. Inside were transcripts of her sessions with Auntie, dating back to the first ones. The discovery sickened her. She stole a few papers, reading them, and feeling bitter questions rise. Determined to uncover the truth, she decided to steal her mother's phone. One day, while her mother was in the shower, she swiped the phone and bolted. On a bus, she found Auntie's name in messages, showing her mother booked appointments. But the text revealed nothing incriminating. She saw they called often, realizing the real conversations happened over calls. Emma's search continued. She looked through her mother's social media, found Auntie's profile under a fake name, and saw photos with her mother's friends, including one with her mother from years ago. The truth hit. Auntie had been friends with her mother before Emma was born. The sessions were a sham, a way to monitor her, not help her. Emma returned home, got beat black and blue, and asked, "Who is Auntie really?" Her mother couldn't answer. The betrayal reshaped Emma's world. She stopped trusting, stopped sharing her sessions with Auntie, a mechanical routine. She watched Auntie closely, noting the sterile room, the laptop's endless clicking, the way her eyes never softened. Emma's mother grew colder, her punishments harsher, as if sensing Emma's defiance. The house felt like a cage, its walls closing in, the transcripts a chain binding her to her mother's control. Emma planned her escape. She saved money from odd jobs, hid it in a sock under her bed, and waited for her chance. At 17, she applied to a university far away. Her grades just enough to get in. A friend, Tom, offered her a place to stay, his pity a lifeline. The day she left, she didn't look back, her mother's screams echoing as she walked out. Freedom was bitter, but it was hers. At university, Emma struggled. The weight of her childhood, the betrayal, clung to her. She avoided therapy, fearing another auntie, another trap. But Tom pushed her gently to try again. She researched obsessively, finding a real psychologist, Dr. Harris, whose credentials checked out. In their first session, Emma blurted out why she was there. Ashamed, Dr. Harris smiled, saying, "We have a lot of work to do." For the first time, Emma felt seen, not used. Years later, cleaning her Instagram, Emma's heart dropped when she saw Auntie's username following her. Clicking the profile, she found it was Auntie's Facebook, listing her as a chemistry teacher, not a psychologist. The truth crystallized. Auntie had never been a therapist, just a friend, complicit in her mother's control. Emma cried that night, mourning the years lost to healing from her childhood. Instead of living freely, Emma blocked the account, cutting the last tie. She told Dr. Harris everything, the suitcase, the phone, the betrayal. He listened, his notes honest, his questions kind. Emma began to heal slowly, the scars of her childhood fading but never gone. She surrounded herself with friends like Tom, people who saw her, not her pain, the house, Auntie, her mother. They were shadows now, but shadows with weight. Emma's life moved forward, but the past lingered. She'd dream of Auntie's living room, the laptop's glow, her mother's cold eyes. Each time she'd wake, her heart racing, checking her phone for that username, fearing it had found her again. It never did. But Emma knew some betrayals don't need to follow you. They're already inside. She carried on her sessions with Dr. Harris, a beacon. She shared her story, hoping others with messed up therapy experiences might find solace, promising it gets better with the right people. Emma learned that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt, but only with time and truth. Some people wear masks, not to hide but to control. Some secrets are written, not spoken. Emma learned that in a living room that wasn't safe, with a woman who wasn't who she seemed, and a mother who broke more than her heart. Story number 10. The lake outside the old Irish house shimmered under the moon, but its waters were too still, too dark. Sophie and her friend Lily, lone in the remote countryside, sat in the glow of the living room, unaware of the mist rising from the lake, curling toward the house like fingers. A faint hum filled the air, not from the forest or the wind, but from the water itself. It wasn't a sound you heard, it was a sound you felt, deep in your bones, whispering their names. Sophie's skin prickled. The house wasn't empty anymore. A knock came, sharp and deliberate, from the conservatory door. The girls froze, their laughter dying. The lake's mist pressed against the glass, forming shapes, vague, human-like, but wrong, as if the water had sculpted them. Lily peered through the window, her breath catching. A man stood there, his face half hidden in the fog, his eyes glinting with a light that wasn't moonlight. He didn't speak, but the hum grew louder, urging them to open the door. The house creaked, its walls shifting, as if the lake wasn't just outside, it was inside, its presence seeping through the floorboards, calling them to step closer, to let it in. So, my best friend and I are both from London, but her family on her dad's side is from Ireland. So she goes there every summer for the entire summer. Sophie had joined Lily for 2 weeks at her grandfather's house in rural Ireland, a place so isolated the nearest town was a 40-minute drive. Last summer, too, I went to go and stay with her for a couple of weeks at her granddad's house. And her granddad lives in rural Ireland, like really rural. The town is at least a 40-minute drive away, and his house is the only building within the area. The house backed onto a dense forest and faced a lake, its beauty almost haunting. It also backs onto a massive forest and faces onto a lake, too. It's really quite beautiful. To be honest, one evening, Lily's family, grandfather, brother, aunt, and father went to the pub, leaving the girls alone. You see, my best friend's granddad, brother, aunt, and dad were going to the pub one evening. They invited the girls, but they chose to stay, thrilled to have the house to themselves. They invited us, which was, of course, a tempting offer, but we declined as we were excited at the prospect of having the house to ourselves, something that doesn't happen a lot given that we were teenagers. They planned a relaxed night, playing house. So we decided to have a bit of a chill evening and basically play house. Hours passed. The family's still at the pub. Of course, if you've been to Ireland, then you know that a quick pint is anything but quick. And her family. They had been gone for some time by this point, a few hours at least, around 10 p.m. A knock interrupted their movie. We were watching a movie in her living room when we heard a knock on the door. Thinking it was family forgetting keys, they approached the conservatory door. We figured that maybe it was her family who had forgotten their keys. So we went to go and answer. Her granddad's front door led onto the conservatory, which then led to the actual front door of the house. A man stood there, his appearance unsettling, wild-eyed, too alert. So we made it to the conservatory door expecting her family, but instead there was a man at the door. There was something off about him, to say the least. He sort of looked insane, bizarrely alert, and yet slightly scary. He claimed his car broke down and needed a phone. He said that his car had broken down and he needed to use the phone to call someone to pick him up. Sophie saw no car. I looked out, but couldn't see a car anywhere, and said something to the effect of, "Well, where's your car?" He said it was 30 minutes down the road. He responded by explaining that he had broken down about 30 minutes down the road and had walked until he had found a house. Lily offered her mobile, but he insisted on using the landline, asking if adults were home. With slight hesitation, my friend passed him phone and said that he could call who he needed to call and wait on the doorstep. But he didn't accept the offer. Instead, he just kind of ignored it and started asking if there were any adults or parents in the house. They admitted the adults were out, but might return soon. But given the situation, we explained that they were out, but they may be back any minute now. His behavior turned erratic, demanding to come inside. It was then that he started to sort of look past us and into the house, and then began insisting that we let him in the house as he wanted to use the landline. He was erratic all of a sudden, continuously insisting that we let him in. Lily refused, offering her phone again or telling him to leave. At this point, my friend said that he either use her mobile or that he needs to leave. But beyond that, there was nothing more that we could do for him. He persisted, so they locked both doors. He again insisted that he come into the house, so we just shut the door on him, locked it, and then locked the door to the actual house as well. Terrified, they watched him linger outside, peering through windows. Freaked out, we sat in her living room trying to peep out the window and see if he had gone. We lingered for a little bit looking into the windows. He eventually left, direction unclear, but then we saw him leave. Though we couldn't make out what direction that he actually went in, Lily noted the small town's familiarity, making the stranger's presence odd. And to add fuel to the fire, my friend explained that the nearby town was pretty small and everyone in the area pretty much knew each other, and she had never seen him in her life, which scared her as she was acquainted with most of the town by now. Later, the dog grew restless, barking in the dark garden. Later on, her dog was getting restless, and her family was still out. So we let her into the back garden, and after about 5 minutes, we heard her barking, but it was too dark to see what she was barking at. They assumed it was a goat and called her in, so we put it down to more than likely being a goat, because that was usually the case. We called her in and we just went about our night, deciding to sleep. Sophie went to the kitchen for water and heard the back door handle rattle violently. I went into the kitchen, which is at the back of the house, to get some water. When I heard someone shaking the handle of the back door trying to get in, the old house's door seemed frail. The thing is that it's a really old house. So I didn't exactly put all my faith in the door holding up against the weight of what I expected to be a grown man. Lily ran down, shouting about calling the police. My friend ran down the stairs. My friend shouted back that she was going to call the police, which was a lie, as she had taken our phones upstairs. But she thought that it may deter him. The rattling stopped, footsteps fading, and luckily, this seemed to finally scare him off. He stopped banging and we heard his footsteps move further and further away until we couldn't hear them anymore. Frozen. They hid in the pantry when the front door opened, only to hear Lily's father. Then we heard the front door open and we pretty much thought that that was it for us. On instinct, my friend grabbed a knife and we hid in the pantry. And you can only imagine our relief when we heard her dad call out for us, saying that they were back. They asked about a car. The family saw none. We frantically asked them, "Did you see a car on your way here, or a broken car or whatever?" And they responded that they didn't. No trace of the man was found. We never did find out who that man was. So the guys went out and took a look around, but they never found anything. His intentions were clearly sinister, and while I don't know everything about what was going on, obviously, one thing was for certain. He was trying to get into this place, and he definitely did not have good intentions. The lake was the key. The girls hadn't noticed at first, but the mist from its surface wasn't natural. It moved with purpose, curling around the house, seeping through cracks. Sophie's dreams that night were vivid. A figure by the lake, its face obscured, humming a tune that echoed the one she'd felt earlier. The dog's barking hadn't been at a goat. The garden was empty, but the grass was wet, as if someone had walked through it. The next day, Lily's grandfather mentioned local tales of a lake spirit, a figure tacked to drownings in the 1800s, drawn to those alone in the house. The mist, he said, was a sign, a warning, or an invitation. Sophie never returned, but the hum followed her, faint in quiet moments, as if the lake still called her name. Story number 11. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows, its trees looming like silent giants over the small clearing where the tent stood. 13-year-old Jamie, on a school camping trip, felt the weight of the woods as he unpacked his bag, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The campsite was alive with laughter, kids building boats, kicking footballs, roasting marshmallows, but the forest's edge felt watchful, its darkness a curtain hiding something alive. Jamie's tent, cramped with 12 other boys, was a flimsy shield against the night, and he sensed it even then. The campfire's glow faded as the group settled into their tents, the forest swallowing the last echoes of their voices. Jamie chose a spot at the back, his sleeping bag pressed against the canvas wall, and realized he'd forgotten his pajamas. He curled up in his clothes, the cold seeping through, and drifted into uneasy sleep. Then a sound, a deep guttural rumble, like the earth itself groaning, jerked him awake. His heart pounded, his eyes straining in the dark. Certain something was inside the tent with him. He turned slowly, his breath shallow, and saw them. Two tall, hunched figures, their forms jagged and wrong, looming over his suitcase. They moved with purpose, clawing through his belongings, their shapes barely human in the dim light. Jamie's hand shook as he reached out, touching one, its surface rough like ancient wood, the touch burned cold, and a wave of dizziness swept over him, the tent spinning as the figures turned, their faces hidden, but their presence heavy with intent. Jamie's voice broke the silence, a weak, "Who's there?" But the words were swallowed by darkness. His vision blurred, and he fell into a void, the rumble echoing in his skull. When he woke, his phone's alarm, a device he wasn't supposed to have, blared. Though he'd sworn it was off, the tent was still, the other boys stirring, but the air felt tainted, as if the creatures had left something behind, watching from the shadows. The morning light did little to ease Jamie's fear. He stumbled outside, the forest cold and unforgiving, and found a dead rabbit near his sleeping spot, its body torn, its eyes glassy. The sight twisted his stomach, a scene that the night's terror wasn't a dream. He felt the forest's gaze, its trees leaning closer, their branches whispering secrets he couldn't decipher. The creatures, whatever they were, had been real, and they knew he'd seen them. When I was 13 years old, I went camping with my school at some point. When I arrived, I noticed the camping spot was just some tents in a dark and creepy forest. The tents were also small, and we even had to share a tent with 12 other people. The campsite was a haphazard cluster, the tents sagging under the weight of the forest's presence. I liked the activities that we did. We built a boat, we played football, and we roasted marshmallows around a campfire. The day had been fun, a blur of teamwork and laughter, but the forest shadow loomed larger as night fell, its silence a warning Jamie couldn't ignore. When it was time for sleeping, I chose the bed all the way at the back. I opened my suitcase and realized I did not bring my pajamas. So I slept with my normal clothes on for a few hours until the rumbling woke him. I slowly turned around and two tall creatures hunched over my suitcase. They were searching for something. Their forms were skeletal, their limbs too long, their movements jerky, like puppets carved from wood. I thought I reached my arm out to touch whoever this person was, and I felt something harsh. If I were to describe it, I would say that it felt something like old wood. The texture was dry, splintered, not human, and it sent a chill through him. After I had touched it, though, I asked who it was, and then I just sort of blacked out. When Jamie woke, his phone's alarm pierced the tent. In the morning, I was woken up by my alarm on my phone. We were not allowed to bring a phone, so I was sure that I had turned my alarm off before sleeping. He froze, pretending to sleep as the other boys grumbled. My alarm woke up most of the kids in the tent. They asked whose it was, so I acted just like I was sleeping to avoid being suspected. He slipped outside, the cold biting his skin. I walked around the tent and I peed in the bushes. I turned around and I saw a dead rabbit right outside of where I slept. I called the teacher and he told me that it must have been killed by something and offered to have it removed. Jamie nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the creature's jagged films, their silent search. The rabbit wasn't just a kill, it was a message left where he'd slept, a mark of something watching. He spent the day in a daze, eating candy in his sleeping bag, avoiding the forest's edge. This day was not really that interesting. I mostly just sort of laid in bed, eating candy and thinking about what happened that night. Night fell again, the campfire's warmth a fleeting comfort. It quickly turned to dark and we roasted some more marshmallows and we ate some pasta that night. The pasta was actually cold and stale, but I was hungry, so I didn't care that much. The food sat heavy in Jamie's stomach. His thoughts, consumed by the creatures. 1 hour later, and it was almost bedtime, and my teacher had told me that if I wanted to go to the bathroom at night, I would have to go in a duo because the forest is very dangerous at night. He chose a partner, but the warning felt hollow. The forest already claiming him, and it was bedtime, and I made my bed, and eventually I fell asleep. Again, though, I was woken up, but this time not by weird creatures, but by my urge to pee. His partner wouldn't wake, so Jamie went alone, his flashlight weak against the dark. I walked all the way out to the front of the tent, waking some up in the process, and I walked out. It was cold and really dark at this stage. In fact, I could barely see. He moved toward the toilets, the forest a wall of shadow, and then he saw it. I looked over to the benches, and there it was again, looking at me. It was tall, and it seemed to have something in its hands. The creature stood by the benches, its form sharper now, holding what looked like a small, limp animal, its head tilted, its face hidden, but Jamie felt its gaze, heavy and ancient, pinning him in place. It looked like an animal, but I was stood still looking at it for maybe about 20 seconds until I decided to just continue walking to the toilets. He forced himself to move, his legs trembling, and reached the toilet. I opened the toilet door and I did my business. I washed my hands and I left. And when I returned back at the benches and looked again, the creature was now gone. Jamie stood frozen, the forest silent, but the air was thick with the creature's presence. He hurried back to the tent, his heart racing, and crawled into his sleeping bag, eyes wide in the dark. The other boys slept, unaware, but Jamie knew the creatures were still out there, watching, waiting. The next day, he searched the camp, finding no tracks, no signs. But the rabbit's blood stained his memory, a warning he couldn't shake. Jamie never spoke of the creatures, afraid no one would believe him. The forest had marked him, its shadows following him home. He avoided camping, refused to sleep near windows, and kept his phone off at night, fearing the alarm's unnatural ring. In his dreams, the creatures returned, their wooden hands reaching, their unseen eyes boring into him. He researched the forest, finding old tales of beings that guarded the woods, spirits of bark and bone, punishing those who lingered too long. The campsite was abandoned years later, the forest reclaiming it. But Jamie felt its pull. He found a small carving in his suitcase months after. A crude figure of wood, its surface rough like what he'd touched. He burned it, but the forest's gaze lingered. A whisper in the dark. Jamie lived on. But the creatures were a part of him now, their presence a scar that stirred in the quiet of the night. Story number 12. The night was a void, swallowing the world beyond Clara's bedroom window. At 18, she was no stranger to the grip of sleep paralysis, a familiar terror that pinned her to the bed, unable to move, her eyes darting in panic. It began when she was 13, a shadow in the mirror, featureless, hovering behind her as she lay frozen. That shadow had faded over the years, a memory she buried. But it was back now, sharper, closer, and it had eyes. Clara had visited a friend's house with her boyfriend, Ethan, where tales of the paranormal were shared like campfire stories. Something about that night, that place, had stirred the darkness, and it followed her home. They'd brought her Ouija board, a dusty relic she'd hung on her wall after a year of silence. Clara doubted its power, but Ethan's friend, Matt, lived in a nowhere town where ghost stories felt real. They walked the train tracks to a ghost town, its empty buildings whispering of forgotten lives, and set up the board under a moonless sky. Clara's fingers trembled as she asked, "Are there any spirits who want to communicate?" The planchette twitched, spelling GEO, or was it get out? Panic seized them. They said goodbye before it finished, fleeing back to Matt's house. The board abandoned in the dark. The Ouija's warning wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Clara laughed it off, blaming Matt's prank. But the air felt heavier. The night too still. Back home, alone, she drifted off mid-prayer, only to wake in paralysis. The shadow returned, now with glowing eyes, leaning close. Its presence was no longer a blur, it was solid, its gaze piercing, as if it knew her. She fought, flailing in her mind, begging to wake, but it hovered, unyielding, its form filling her room with dread. Clara woke, gasping, dismissing it as sleep paralysis. But the fear lingered, a seed planted deep in her chest. The next night, it came again, and this time it spoke. Clara, her praying again, slipped into sleep, only to be trapped once more. The shadow was closer, its eyes burning, its form bending toward her ear. She thrashed, her screams silent as it whispered, "I'm keeping you here forever." The words weren't just sound. They were a weight, a chain pulling her into a realm that wasn't sleep, wasn't a dream. Clara begged, citing work, life, anything to escape, and in desperation promised it could return tomorrow. She woke, heart pounding, the room too quiet, the promise echoing like a curse she couldn't unsay. The shadow wasn't new, but it had changed. At 40, it was just a shape, a featureless blur in the mirror, gone by morning. Now, it had intent, a presence that felt personal. Clara's room, once a sanctuary, was a cage. She checked the locks, the windows, but nothing kept it out. Ethan, shaken, admitted to nightmares since the ghost town, vivid dreams of a figure watching him. He suggested night terrors, but Clara knew it was more. The shadow felt real, its touch cold, its voice a vow. The Ouija board, left behind, seemed to have opened a door, and something had stepped through, claiming her. Clara avoided sleep, her eyes heavy, her prayers unfinished. The ghost town wasn't just abandoned, it was marked. Matt had warned of its history, a place where trains stopped running, where houses stood empty, their windows like eyes. Locals spoke of a presence, a thing that lingered in the track's shadows, drawn to those who called it. Clara scoured X, finding stories of Ouija sessions gone wrong, boards that spoke, then haunted. One user described a shadow with eyes, whispering promises of return. Clara's promise to the shadow wasn't a bargain. It was a trap, and she'd walked into it willingly. The house felt different, its silence oppressive. Clara moved the Ouija board to the garage, its wooden surface cold, as if it held the night's chill. She burned sage, a ritual her mother taught her, but the smoke curled wrong, pooling in corners. Ethan stayed over, his presence a comfort, but his sleep was restless, his dreams echoing hers. Clara told him everything, her fear that it wasn't sleep paralysis, that it was real. They searched the ghost town's history online, finding whispers of a tragedy, a worker lost to the tracks, his name forgotten, his anger not. The shadow wasn't just a dream, it was a claim, a debt she'd invited. Clara's nights became a battle. She set alarms to stay awake, drank coffee until her hands shook, but sleep always won. Each time the shadow was there, promising eternity, its voice a blade against her ear. She woke crying, her body heavy, as if it had fought in a place she couldn't see. She feared her promise, terrified it would return and keep her. On X, she shared her story, begging for answers. Replies warned of entities that latch onto Ouija users, feeding on fear, growing stronger with each call. Some urged her to burn the board, others to seek a priest. Clara didn't know what it was, demon, spirit, or her own mind, but its eyes followed her, and the night was no longer hers. Story number 13. The forest was a sanctuary, its darkness a cloak for secrets no one dared to name. Elliot, on a midnight walk, felt the night shift, as if it knew he was there. A scent, animal and wrong, clung to the air, hinting at life where none should be. Then came the footsteps, steady on the gravel, leading him deeper into the unknown. But when they stopped, the silence screamed louder than any sound ever could. Elliot, a solitary soul in his late 20s, found solace in nighttime walks through the forest near his small town. He decided to go for a walk in the forest in his favorite clearing, a beautiful spot located on a hill with an amazing view over a field and off into the distance. The clearing, perched atop a hill, offered a breathtaking vista of fields stretching into the horizon, a place where he'd watched countless sunsets. He'd even watched a few sunsets there, and it has always been one of his go-to places. A campfire pit, occasionally used by others, sat at its center. There's also a campfire there, which seems to be used occasionally by other people. On this night, Elliot left his apartment under a starless sky, choosing to forego a flashlight. The night was pitch black, but he chose not to use a light. He wanted the quiet, the warmth of the evening to envelop him undisturbed. Maybe he just didn't want to attract attention and preferred to enjoy the quiet warmth of the evening alone. As he walked, the forest silence was profound, broken only by his soft steps. The path wound past an old farm, its weathered barns looming in the dark. He passed an old farm next to the road leading to the clearing. He'd seen it countless times, always empty, abandoned. He had passed that farm many times before and had never seen any animals, people, or cars around it. But tonight, a sharp, musky scent hit him. Unmistakably animal. An unmistakable farm animal smell hit him, something that he had never experienced there before. The scent was jarring. A thick, earthy musk that didn't belong. It was that sort of typical earthy, musky scent that you get when animals are around. Elliot scanned the darkness, expecting to see a stray cow or horse. But the farm was as lifeless as ever. Instinctively, he looked around, hoping to spot something in the darkness. But just as always, the place was completely empty. The smell lingered, heavy and unnatural, as if the air itself carried a memory of life long gone. No animals, no signs of life, nothing except the strong smell lingering in the air. Shrugging it off, Elliot continued to the clearing, his unease a faint whisper in his mind. He found that a bit strange, but shook it off and continued walking. At the clearing, he settled by the campfire pit, its ashes hiding glowing embers. When he inspected the campfire, he noticed that beneath the ash there were some embers still glowing. A stack of firewood lay nearby, left by previous visitors. There was also firewood stacked nearby, left by whoever had been there before. Elliot rekindled the fire, its warm light pushing back the dark. He decided to rekindle the fire using the leftover wood. Lying on the grass, he gazed at the star. The sky a vast canvas of light. Soon he was lying on the ground next to it, stargazing and watching up in the night sky. For hours, the peace held him, the crackle of the fire his only companion. For a couple of hours, he enjoyed the peaceful night. The forest felt like a world apart, its silence a gift, until the firewood ran out and the fire faded to ash. As the last embers died, the darkness reclaimed the clearing, the moon too dim to offer light. He ran out of firewood and didn't feel like venturing into the woods for more, so let the fire die out and allowed himself to drift into the quiet darkness. Elliot lay still, savoring the quiet, when a sound shattered the calm. Footsteps, deliberate and heavy. On the gravel road, suddenly he heard footsteps coming toward him from the gravel road, loud and distinct in the silent night. The fire was gone, the night near impenetrable. The fire had burned out completely, and the moon was dim, leaving everything in near total darkness. He couldn't see the source, nor could they see him, hidden in the shadows. At this stage, he couldn't see them, and obviously they couldn't see him, lying low. Elliot listened, tracking the steps by sound alone. As he lay there on the ground, hidden by the darkness, he listened closely and tracked their movement by sound alone. Curiosity overtook fear, and he rose, following the unseen walker as the footsteps passed him. He got up and started following them. It felt natural. They were heading toward his town. A coincidence of paths. It wasn't strange to him at the time. He was heading home, and they just so happened to be going in the same direction toward his town. He stayed back, his steps soft, aware of his advantage. He felt a strange sense of advantage that they didn't know that he was there, but he knew about them. The gravel shifted under his feet, mingling with the stranger's steady pace. Their footsteps remained steady, and he could hear his own footfalls joining theirs. But then, without reason, the footsteps ahead stopped, swallowed by silence. All of a sudden, without warning, their footsteps just vanished. Elliot froze, confusion giving way to unease. He stopped confused. He continued walking, passing the farm again, its musky scent now fainter but still present. He continued down the road, passing the farm again. Something felt wrong, so he paused, turning to face the darkness. Something nagged at him, so he paused, turned around, and waited, expecting to see someone emerge from the darkness behind him. He waited, eyes straining, ears alert for any sound, a rustle, a step, anything. He stood there for quite some time, staring into the darkness, waiting for a moment, a sound, anything. But the forest was silent, unnaturally so. There was nothing, no footsteps, no rustling in the trees, no sign of anyone. The absence gnawed at him. That's really when he became unsettled the most. If it was a person they hadn't known he was following, his steps could have startled them, prompting them to hide. If it had been a person walking ahead of him, they wouldn't have known that he was there. But hiding would make noise, branches breaking, leaves shifting. If they had jumped off the road onto the forest to hide or escape, there should have been some noise. There was none. There was nothing. The next day, Elliot returned, the clearing bathed in daylight. The next day, when he went back, he could clearly see his footsteps. His shoe prints marked the gravel, clear and solitary. You could see the imprint of his shoe and all, but there were no other footprints anywhere, no other tracks, no sign of another soul. The forest, the farm, the footsteps, they formed a puzzle with no answer. A night that lingered in Elliot's mind, whispering of something that walked but left no trace. Story number 4. In the stillness of a wooded Ontario night, where the forest whispered secrets to the stars, a strange light danced among the fruit trees. Clara's family home, nestled at the edge of a dense wilderness, was a quiet haven until it wasn't. Clara's father, climbing the stairs to bed, glanced out the window and froze. A bluish-white light, neither bright nor dim, had drifted 3 feet off the ground, weaving through the orchard. It wasn't a flashlight, not a reflection. It was alive, moving with purpose. And what it left behind would mark their family forever. The light was hypnotic, gliding silently among the apple and cherry trees. Clara's father, thinking it was a prowler, readied himself for a confrontation. But no human held that glow. It was a ball of light, floating freely, as Clara later described. He called his wife and daughter to the window, their breath fogging the glass as they watched, transfixed. The family stood bewildered, unable to name what they saw. The night was still, the forest beyond their yard a wall of shadow, and the light seemed to belong to neither. Clara's father, emboldened, decided to investigate. He grabbed a jacket, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and defiance. But as he opened the door, the light retreated, weaving through the fruit trees into the thicker forest beyond, silent as a ghost. Clara and her mother, unnerved, retreated to bed, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the eye. Her father stayed, mesmerized, watching the light return to the yard. drifting aimlessly. It lingered, then vanished into the trees, leaving only questions in its wake. The morning brought terror. Clara woke to her father shouting in panic. He'd gone blind overnight. His eyes, once sharp, saw only darkness. She and her mother rushed him to the hospital, where the doctor diagnosed a retinal burn, like those seen in welders without masks. But her father, an office worker, had never welded. The blindness was temporary, fading in days, but the mystery wasn't. The source of the light was never determined, a puzzle that haunted Clara long after. The orchard, once a place of summer sweetness, now felt like a threshold to something unknown. The forest beyond their yard held no answers, only whispers of ancient secrets. Clara's family searched for explanations, stray lasers, rare fireflies, but nothing fit. The light's movement, its silence, its effect on her father defied logic. Clara, who'd heard the story from her friend years later, felt its weight. It was the only paranormal tale her friend ever told. Carrying a ring of truth, the house stood unchanged, but Clara imagined it watching, its trees hiding mysteries older than the family who lived there. The incident reshaped Clara's friend. Her father, recovered but shaken, avoided the orchard at night. Clara's mother hung heavier curtains, as if to block more than moonlight. They spoke little of it, the memory too raw, too strange. Clara's friend, now distant, scoured folklore, finding tales of will-o'-the-wisps and spirit lights, but none matched the burning glow. The forest, vast and unyielding, seemed to guard its truth, its shadows deeper after that night. Clara's friend never walked the orchard again, haunted by what they'd seen. Years later, the story lingered like a chill in Clara's bones. She'd lost touch with her friend, but the tale stayed vivid, a warning of things unseen. The family had checked for natural causes, gas leaks, electrical faults, but found nothing. The orchard remained, its trees bearing fruit, but Clara's friend avoided it, her steps careful, her eyes wary. The light was gone, but its mark was permanent, a reminder that some mysteries burn brighter than answers, leaving scars no doctor could explain. The wooded area of Ontario whispered its own legends, tales of lights in the wild, of travelers led astray. Clara wondered if her friend's father had seen something ancient, tied to the land itself. She kept her own windows covered now, a habit born from the story's weight. The hospital's diagnosis offered no closure, only questions. The light had chosen that night, that man, that orchard, and Clara, retelling it years later, still felt its kutuktuko in her friend's trembling voice, a flicker of the unknown that refused to fade.